Toronto isn't the only North American city grappling with what to do about its expressway. During the post-World War II period, urban expressways were a vital link from the suburbs to a city's downtown core. Now they are crumbling and in need of major repair. Joining us now for more on the fate of these freeways in Houston, Texas, Kyle Shelton, postdoctoral fellow at the Kinder Institute for Urban Research at Rice University. And Kyle, we're very happy to have you on TVO about this tonight. This is quite a hot topic in our city, our capital city in Ontario right now, as you know. So let's do a little background first. All of these expressways, or most of them, built all around the same time for the same reasons? Tell us.
Well, Steve, that's a good question. You're going to see a lot of the first urban highways being built in the 20s and the 30s as cars become a major problem in urban centers across North America. But what we think of today as these massive urban highways aren't going to really be built until the post-World War II period. So both the Gardiner and Toronto and many of the other urban freeways throughout America and Canada are going to start to be planned in the early 40s, mid 40s, and you're going to see construction beginning in the early 1950s and finishing up anywhere between the late 1950s and early 1960s.
Any idea what the common motives were among the highway builders at the time, why they wanted to get them up, then big, solid, etc.? Yeah,
so I think the majority of the motives behind these urban freeways are that major metropolitan areas in both Canada and the United States after World War II are undergoing massive changes in their built environment and their demographic settlement patterns. And in particular, these metropolitan areas were experiencing great levels of suburbanization. And so the powers that be, usually elected officials, chambers of commerce, other interested actors who were rooted in the downtowns of these metro areas, really wanted to see the downtown areas maintain vitality even as suburbanization progressed. And so one way that they saw that they could do that would be to build urban freeways that could connect suburban areas more directly to the downtown. And that served a couple of purposes. It would allow suburbanites who had recently moved away from central cities to come back to town for their jobs or for shopping or for other forms of recreation. And another thing that city leaders saw that new highways could afford the opportunity for would be the remaking of the urban fabric, and in particular the removal of areas that many officials saw as blighted, called blighted, or saw as slums. And in most cases, this was minority neighborhoods or lower income neighborhoods that officials said, well, we can take this opportunity, we have to build this road to try to save downtown, to keep it vital, and we can also use it as a way to redesign the city in a way that we think might propel it forward into the 1950s and 1960s with more promise. We can remove these problem areas.
Well, that might lead actually to my next question, which was, what were the unintended consequences of building these big concrete ribbons through the downtowns?
Yeah, I think the consequences are still readily apparent in a lot of cities. These especially the elevated highways, lead to the creation of really obvious barriers between neighborhoods. Often in the neighborhoods that got the highways built through them, they were very disruptive and removed thousands of homes and businesses and schools and churches. And as I said, the majority of those consequences really did fall on, in the United States, African Americans and Hispanic individuals and often lower income Americans as well. And so those people's communities and their day-to-day patterns were often really disrupted by the construction of the roads.
Given what Toronto's going through right now, we thought it might be instructive to look at 3 other cities and see how they handled not identical, but similar circumstances, certainly. And the one we want to start with is what they called the Big Dig in Boston, Massachusetts. Sure. Give us some of the background here. What were they trying to do? How much was it supposed to cost? How did it go?
Yeah, well, so the Big Dig was a continuation of an earlier urban freeway called the Central Artery in Boston that was begun construction in the early 1950s and continued into the 1960s. And the Big Dig was the proposal to put it underground, to tunnel it, I believe 8 to 10 lanes, and to remove the above ground expressway from the center of Boston. It runs right through the center of town and, like I said, had been really disruptive to the form and function of the city. And so the State Department of Transportation planned to do the Big Dig, and I believe originally, like the first forecast was something like $3 billion or somewhere around there in a ballpark. And they recently released the figures with interest that it would cost now, I believe, $24 billion. So it's quite a change, and I think most people think of the Big Dig as kind of a planning and construction boondoggle. It took almost 25 years from the beginning of planning to the opening of it, but one thing that I think is really important is to reflect on its current situation and its current position in the city. It's now done, it's constructed, and is functioning very well. And one of the things that, one of the great outcomes from the Big Dig is now that Boston has this large swath of land that previously had this barrier freeway on it, open for green space and parks and other real estate and development opportunities that they've really been taking a great deal of advantage of.
I'd like our director, Sheldon Osmond, to bring up those series of pictures one more time. Now that you've had a chance to describe it, there is what Boston used to look like. You can see the elevated highways wrapping around the city. And then as you dissolve to the next picture, lots of green space. The highway is now underground. Yes, it cost a fortune. Yes, it went over budget and over time. But today, are people happy with what they've got?
Yeah, that's my impression. And the Rose Kennedy Parkway that is over the top of the Cap Tunnel is a great social space. It's a great piece of Boston's new identity and has really reconnected a lot of that city. And neighborhoods that used to be isolated by the central artery are now much more tied in on a local grid status than they were before. You can walk, you can bike, you can drive back and forth. And not have to encounter this major piece of infrastructure any longer.
And I think they named the tunnel after the greatest hitter in the history of Major League Baseball, Ted Williams, which makes a lot of sense since he played for the Red Sox.
That is correct.
Right
yeah.
on. All right, let's move to New York
Absolutely.
City right now. The West Side Highway in New York City. Sheldon, maybe you want to bring these pictures up, and we'll take a look at them now just ahead of time, and then we can have a look after Kyle describes what's happened here. But it was once an elevated highway, and now it's a 6 to 8 lane urban boulevard, an option, incidentally, that was rejected by the City of Toronto very recently in that City Council vote. So once again, Kyle, what was the plan, what did they get, and how did it turn out?
Yeah, so Steve, as you alluded to, the precursor to the current highway, the current parkway, was the West Side Elevated Highway. That was one of the roads that I mentioned earlier that was built in the 1920s by the City of New York and by the State of New York. And it was an attempt to deal with the mounting congestion problems in 1920s and 30s American cities. That road reached the end of its functional life in the 1970s. It ended disastrously with a collapse, I believe, in 1973. And then there was a series of initiatives and plans to build actually something very similar to the Big Dig underneath the existing highway and tunneling underneath the west side of Manhattan. That was blocked by a very concerted effort by a wide number of actors in New York. And eventually the West Side Highway was settled upon, and it is, as you described, a boulevard of 6 to 8 lanes. It uses the roads that were underneath the old elevated highway, and much the same way that the Big Dig allowed for the opening and reopening of a number of parcels of land and vacant land nearby. That's what the West Side Highway has kind of done for the west side of Manhattan as well. The former industrial and commercial docks that are on the west side of the island are now turning into recreational spaces and parks and other types of attractions. The roadway is crossable by pedestrians. They have bike lanes on it, and it's created a much different area on the west side of Manhattan.
Now, let's do one more. You're in Houston, Texas right now, and Houston is going through, I gather, a great debate about what to do with, what do they call it, the Pierce Expressway?
It's the Pierce Elevated locally, yep.
Okay.
Houston has a reputation. Houston has the reputation of being a highway metropolis, and it's certainly well deserved. We have a lot of lane miles here, and very recently, TxDOT, the Texas Department of Transportation, just released a very large plan for the entirety of the Interstate 45 corridor, the road that runs north to Dallas. They're going to be proposing to redo the entirety of the corridor, basically from our second ring road down through downtown and out southeast towards Galveston. And so it's a major system overhaul, but one of the pieces that has been really garnering a lot of attention is the choice to tear down the Pierce Elevated. So the Pierce Elevated was built in the later period of the time that I was talking about. It started in the mid-1960s, opened in 1968. And it's similar to the Gardiner in Toronto, a relatively short elevated section. It's about 2.3 miles, I think, or thereabouts, and it connects two of the highways through the center of downtown. And like the other projects we've discussed, it really did separate a lot of directly downtown, central downtown Houston from what is called Midtown here, and changed a lot of the patterns of life in Houston in the 1960s, destroyed the northern part of a historically African-American neighborhood, the Third Ward, and has been now a part of Houston's landscape for almost 50 years. And like the Gardiner is reaching the end of its functional life, and so trying to decide what to do with that is a key part of this major system overhaul. And there's been a lot of interesting debate here, as there has been in Toronto, about what the best solutions for that are. Is it maintain it and put in the work to keep it functional? Is it take it down altogether, or is it to turn it into some type of Highline Park, Houston's version of the Highline, or some other use that could be it could be dedicated to, that wouldn't necessarily just be car traffic? And so that's been a really captivating conversation to be a part of. I personally think the options for taking it down really offer a lot of great opportunities for the city to look at. And there are some ways to do a little bit of both. I think you can use portions of it for some type of Highline Park. There's the end on the west side of the city in Houston is still going to have an elevated section of off ramps coming into town. So maybe you keep part of that up and do something innovative there. But I think these projects offer cities a chance to really rethink the choices they're making about their infrastructure. And what they want, especially central cities, to look like now that these downtown roadways are coming to the end of their lives.
Okay, Kyle, speaking of coming to the end, we're coming to the end of this segment, and we can't leave it before we spend the last couple of minutes here having you tell us what lessons from the three examples that we've done so far, Boston, New York, Houston, what lessons can Ontario's capital city learn from those experiences that we ought to apply to the situation here in the province of Ontario?
Sure. I think there are three major things. First, it seems to me that the impetus for urban expressway removal or discussions and rerouting is all based on the fact that more and more people want to live in tied together, cohesive, walkable, drivable, bikeable downtowns that aren't disrupted by major pieces of infrastructure. And in particular, they want access to the amenities and to the parts of town that are really drawing people back into central cities. So in Toronto, that might be the waterfront, and that's the case in New York as well. People want access to that space, and as I said, it creates a lot of good opportunities for new public spaces, new developments, and new futures for our cities. Two other sort of broader things that I think are important to keep in mind is that these systems are these elements are a part of much broader systems, and so that always needs to be a part of the conversation. So here in Houston, as I said, the Pierce Elevated, it's kind of a sexy topic. It's easy to talk about this elevated and what to do with it, but we often lose sight of the fact that this is a part of a huge overhaul of the entire system that's really going to change mobility for the entire metropolitan area. So I think that's a key component to maintain as a part of these conversations, that the Big Dig can't be separated from the rest of Boston's transit choices, be that mass transit, be that more roadways, whatever that entails, it needs to be a part of that. And then third and finally, these are systems that take a lot of time and take a lot of money, and recognizing the choices that we made 40 years ago, 50 years ago, it's really important for us to really think through what we're doing today, because the choices we're making right now are going to continue to persist up until 2040, 2050, and these are opportunities that come along for cities only very rarely because of how durable and how long-lasting our infrastructure is.
Well, in fact, we've been told that the decision the Toronto City Council made this week is meant to last 100 years. That's how important this decision is. I mean, we've been inundated by numbers over the last several months as this debate has progressed here in Toronto, and I wonder if your advice is, it doesn't matter what they say in terms of what it's going to cost or how long it's going to take, multiply by a factor of 5 or something. Is that probably right?
I mean, the numbers and the estimates are always hard to wrap your head around. And I mean, going back to the Big Dig, there's belief that some people in Boston, some of the officials in Boston undersold the estimates. So it's always hard to know what is the truth in that matter and what the final cost is going to be. But as I said earlier, I think the bottom line is that it's really easy to say, we should be able to move. We shouldn't suffer congestion. I should be able to get to whatever parts of the city I want to, and these systems should just be there. That's often, I think, an assumption that many of us make, And we forget about the fact that these systems, take 10, 20 years to plan and build, and it's not just because it is a politically contentious opportunity, right? It is politically contentious, but it's also just incredibly complicated engineering that is incredibly expensive. And I think for many of us today who didn't experience the building of the original highway systems, at least here in the United States, it's easy to say, oh, these highways are just here. It couldn't have been that bad to build them. It couldn't have been that disruptive. Why don't we build a new one, or why don't we do project X or Y, without really realizing that it is going to cost several billions of dollars, and often tens of billions of dollars, to do these major realignments and reconstructions.
Gotcha. Kyle Shelton, thanks for joining us on the line from Houston, Texas tonight. Good to have you on TVO.
Thanks so much, Steve. It was great to be with y'all.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.